What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Other Guys on the Badlands Podcast Network. I'm Jake Chatsky, joined again, as always, by Paul Kilgallen. Paul was holding it down for the last 2 weeks while I was out, but we are back together. Paul, how you doing? How you feeling?
I'm doing good. I'm happy to see your face again, although I'm not thrilled to see you wearing a Yankee shirt. But I think considering what the Mets have done to the Yankees this season, I can get over it and we can all be pals about it. But more than anything, I'm just happy to see you. Congratulations again on your wedding. How was that, man?
Wedding was amazing. Thank you again for holding it down while I was gone. We had an absolute blast. It was very nice getting my family out to California, except for fucking CrowdStrike making it impossible for people to travel. Don't use them. Use their competitor. But yeah, we had an absolute blast, and you know, it's great. Marriage is great. 10 out of 10. Can't recommend it enough. But we are back because football is officially back. We are diving into training camp and the preseason. And we thought there's no better way to kick off, you know, the start of a new season than by really level setting and asking what our big picture questions are going into the preseason. So Paul and I, we decided to come up with the idea. We separately came up with 5 big questions. There might be some overlap, but if there is, we'll discuss it as we go. But really just wanted to lay down like major talking points as we head into a new season. So Paul, let's dive right into it. I'll pass it over to you. We'll go from 5 to 1. So your fifth biggest question going into training camp. What are you looking for?
Yeah, I think I'm really wondering what's gonna come of Alan Lazard. I think he became such a lightning rod last year, and I think I want to say that like he was never a receiver of the caliber of the contract that he got in the first place. And if we look back at who he was with the Packers, there were periods where Aaron Rodgers was pretty unhappy with him because of drops and different things like that. And so I think he probably played worse than his career last year. And a lot of that is a result of the quarterback play, obviously, and probably moving to a new place. And I don't know how much of it is a New York thing, but certainly below average last year. And so I don't think that we need him to come back to being the guy that got the contract he got last year. But I would like to see him come back to what his career average is, which is like a guy who is big and can get up and get some balls, and he can body some people over the middle. He can make some good blocks in the run game, make a couple contested red zone catches, and hopefully just kind of like not hurt the team too badly, right? And I think based on what we've heard coming out of camp so far, it does seem like it's trending in that direction. There's a lot of good reports about Lazard the last few days. I always like, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I'm a little hesitant to believe everything I hear about what's going on in training camp because there is the possibility that teams are trying to increase the stock of players to be able to move them or whatever. It's just like a lot of other seasons are in the NFL. It's lying season, right? So you can't believe everything you read, but all the reports have been really positive so far. And I think if you can see Lazard come back to just being like a serviceable wide receiver 4 who can be pressed into wide receiver 3 duties if needed, that would be great. And I think that, we probably have to just like forget about the money and swallow that a little bit and flush it because it doesn't matter at this point. The contract's already signed and there's an out after year 2. So for this year, as long as he's going to be on the roster, like let's see what he can give us. And if he can give us just that 3-4 kind of good blocker, get up and make some contested catches, I think that's plenty.
Yeah, I think, when he signed the contract too, obviously there's like the Rodgers element of it, of like appeasing his guy. And I think obviously not having Aaron Rodgers on the field really made it look like, really made it stand out just how bad of a deal that was. But if he can get back with his buddy to being a serviceable member of this offense, I really think it'll come a long way to elevating the pass game. And your question kind of dovetails nicely into my first one, which is outside of Garrett Wilson, who is going to step up and be that number 2 wide receiver, number 2 pass catcher? That's the first thing, or the fifth thing, I should say, I'm looking forward to coming into training camp. Obviously there was the Mike Williams signing in the offseason, but it doesn't look like he's going to be ready week 1. And we haven't seen any, more on that later, but we haven't seen this group of pass catchers with any semblance of competent quarterback play, but you have to imagine that teams are going to be keying in on Garrett Wilson in the early weeks of the season and saying, beat us with anyone else. So who is going to be that guy? Is it going to be Conklin? I don't know that necessarily Malachi Corley is going to be ready to step up and be that guy from the get. So who is going to be that number 2 option when teams try and take away Garrett? I'll be very interested to see in early preseason games, in notes coming out of camp and practices, who is really stepping up into that role.
Yeah, I think like an interesting dark horse for that question is probably Brees. Like he's probably going to see a ton of balls out of the backfield. Gibson's hurt already, so that's going to slide him a little bit. With Corley, the reports have been mostly Bob Saleh saying like he's got a long way to go, he's got a lot of studying to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a lot of that is just who Saleh is. He said all the same things about Garrett Wilson, and then they barely played him in week 1 of his rookie year, and everybody was freaking out. And then he had that huge game against the Browns where he caught the game-winning overtime touchdown, and all of a sudden it was like Garrett Wilson was here already, right? So I wonder how much of what Saleh says about Corley is true and how much of it is he's just trying to like not knock a rookie down, but just like keep him in check a little bit and say all the right things. So, I mean, I guess we'll see when the preseason starts and we'll see where he is, but definitely an interesting question. I think Brees is probably a good dark horse for that. So speaking of running backs, my second one is kind of along the same lines as my first one. What is going to become of Izzy Abanikanda? I think if you're a fan of Badlands, which if you're listening to this, you probably are, right? Like you were excited about Izzy last year. It was a guy Connor was high on, got him in the 4th round and, looked great coming out of Pitt. He's a local kid. It was a good story. He was getting a lot of run in the preseason, and then he had that injury toward the end of the preseason. And then when he came back, like 3/4 of the way through the season, it just like, it looked like he was stuck in mud every time he got the ball, and he got fewer and fewer opportunities. And we got to a point in the season where you would have expected a lot of workload to shift to him just based on where we were as a team. And it wasn't really happening. And then they go out this year, they go in the draft, they get 2 running backs in the draft, which was a surprise to everybody. They also signed Tariq Cohen, who we all still don't really know the reason he's here. I suspect it's kick return related, and a lot of it is going to be like testing it out with a guy who you're not really financially committed to long term. And like, hey, what can we do? Can we slam him into the wall? And like, not to say that you don't care about Tariq Cohen's health, but he's a guy who's had a few injuries. He tends to get hurt pretty much everywhere he goes. And so now you have this 5 running backs on the roster that all like are, potentially legitimate shots to make the roster. And so like, who's the odd man out? And right now it looks like it's Izzy Abanikanda. And I think that would probably be disappointing for a lot of people because we got him last year and everybody was pretty excited about it. So unless he has a big camp, and I don't think his issues were the same as what Lazard's were. Lazard seemed completely disinterested last year. It almost feels like the coaching staff thinks Izzy can't play, which would be kind of surprising. But the Jets have churned through a lot of running backs that they've drafted the last few years where it was like people were excited about it right out of the gate and then it kind of fizzled and they moved him somewhere else. So I'm excited. I shouldn't say I'm excited to see what happens with Izzy. I'm nervous to see what happens with Izzy. Like I hope he can get himself to a good place in camp. Because I mean, the reality is even if he does do really well, there are 2 guys that are drafted this year that are now going to be a priority over him. So he's at best fighting for running back 3, like top level, probably 4 is what he's fighting for.
Yeah. I mean, when the Jets drafted 2 running backs, I think everyone who was like high on Izzy Abanikanda had their radar go up and be like, what does the team think of this player? Because, he dealt with some injuries too, especially early in the preseason, like last year on Hard Knocks. We saw that whole saga, and like when you're a rookie, building those early reps really matter. And then they obviously tried to like force feed Dalvin Cook, which was a hopeless cause from the start of it. So Izzy really kind of, he got stunted before he ever could take off as a Jet. And then they drafted 2 replacements. So it's going to be a really interesting camp battle. But it also dovetails nicely into my next question, which could be a way for manipulating these different running backs who are on the roster. You brought up Tariq Cohen already. I'm curious how the Jets approach these new kickoff rules, because we've talked about it before on this podcast. The game has changed in a drastic way, and there are going to be teams who innovate and who are ahead of the curve and teams who are behind it. And I think the signing of Tariq Cohen points to the Jets at least trying to be in front of it and be experimental and understanding that there is going to be some arbitrage between teams who get this and who can game it to their advantage, whether that's a couple of 10 yards here, 10 yards there, some house calls, and teams who are routinely just treating this as like any other running play and, only getting a couple yards of carry or ending up basically in fair catch territory. I think it's going to be a real disparity in year one, especially in the early weeks, between innovative teams and non-innovative teams. And we're going up against Kyle Shanahan in week one. So I would really, really like to see the Jets. And I don't know that anyone's going to, show all their cards in the preseason anyway.
Right.
But we've gotten reports out of practice about Tariq Cohen busting open big gain and things like that. I would like to see, if he makes the roster, it could be an indication that the Jets are at the forefront of this thing, which would be a good sign going into week one.
Yeah, definitely. We alluded to it on the in the previous question here, and we also on the training camp preview that we did last week, we mentioned that Tariq Cohen might be like something of a crash test dummy for this new kickoff rule, and like let's just like go crazy with it in practice, and we won't show too much, and let's see what we can experiment and come up with. I'm going to approach this question a little differently from the standpoint of Brant Boyer, right? So like you talked pretty much about the personnel, like it's probably going to, from a league perspective, it's probably going to shift away from small, speedy, shifty receivers and move towards small, stout, strong running backs, right? Like the body type is going to change a little bit. So you covered the personnel angle, but from a coaching angle, Brant Boyer has a really good reputation, and he has some good longevity with the Jets now. The Jets actually historically have done really well as special teams coaches. Westhoff had a good run here that spanned a few coaches, and now we've had the same thing with Boyer, who's been here through a few administrations. So he is solid, but based on what I see of him, he seems like more of like a lunch pail special teams guy. Like he doesn't really do anything super crafty or creative. Like he's not running kick return plays where you're kind of masking where the ball is or running reverses or anything funky on punt returns. Like it's kind of straightforward with him. I think what he preaches is just like do the right thing, stay in your lane, make your block, like all that stuff. And I think that he's just like he relies on good scheme and good execution. And I wonder if this new rule is going to be more favorable towards that type of coaching, or if it's going to be more favorable to a type of coach who might be more willing to experiment and try some crazy things. So I'm interested to see how Brant Boyer reacts to it and how his coaching style adapts to the new kickoff rule. Because like I said, I don't think he's super flashy. I think he just kind of relies on scheme. So we'll see what happens there. For my next one, I'm saying, what do we want to see from Will McDonald? And I, there's kind of two sides of this conversation, right? The first one is like, take out the draft status, like put it in a vacuum and just what is Will McDonald going to contribute to a team and a defense that's very good for a guy who probably has all the physical capabilities to be a really, really intriguing pass rush specialist, right? He can't do everything. He's probably going to be a little bit vulnerable against the run, but like if we get leads and we get into a situation where you can just have a speed rusher out on the edge, just flying inside every time, and with the bend he has and the ability to get around an offensive tackle, like what will that bring to the table? And the reason that I say put it in a vacuum and forget about the draft status is that because of where he was taken in the first round, when everybody wanted an offensive lineman in the teens, like there's this push from the fans that like we want to see this guy playing. We want to see him playing a lot. There was that stat floating around last year about how no rookie taken in the first round had fewer snaps than Will McDonald. I forget what the exact parameters of the stat were, but it was something ugly. Basically, like nobody's ever played less than this guy as a first round pick. And so I want to kind of like put that in a vacuum and see what he can contribute to the team. But the reality is that we do have to talk about that other side of the equation because they did invest a first round pick in him in the teens, right? And so I think the fans, because of that, are like really clamoring to see more and more of him and at least know, is this guy good? Is he going to be around? Is he going to be a part of this defense? Or is this something that is going to bust in a couple of years and we're going to move on from it and we're going to all, it's going to be another notch in like the Vernon Gulston, belt proverbially,
Don't
right?
say that
So
name. Don't say that name.
so there's kind of two sides to that Will McDonald thing, and I think I'd prefer to just view it in a vacuum and see what he can bring to the defense. But there's been a couple videos that have been leaking out of him in training camp, like whatever. It's drills, right? It's not live action, but like he's doing